Today's talk is co-sponsored by Hamilton Library, the Spark M. Matsunaga Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution, the Hindi-Urdu Language Program, the International Cultural Studies Program, the Center for South Asian Studies, and the Departments of Ethnic Studies, Political Science, American Studies, and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. That list, in some ways, gives you an inkling of the kind of range that our speaker actually covers. And now, Anjali Roy, who is currently a teacher at Punahou Academy, a podcaster, a broadcaster, a writer of creative nonfiction, a PhD from the Department of English at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and most important for this session, the former editorial assistant and managing editor of the Journal of Biography and the office manager for the Center for Biographical Research, and a classmate of our speaker in our PhD program, will introduce our speaker. Anjali.
Thank you, Craig. Aloha mai kako. I have slides. I'm a little bit extra, so please, I know this is a little unusual to do this for an introduction for a brown bag. I've attended enough of these to know that this is unusual, but I couldn't help myself. So I hope you don't mind if I'm a little bit extra right now. I'm joining you from Oiwi land, of course, on this island of Oahu in the neighborhood of Makiki, just a few miles away from the Center for Biographical Research. Talk number 784. That's so amazing. It is a distinct honor to get to introduce you to a dear friend and soul love of mine named Rajiv Mohabir. And I can't wait to hear from him about his beautiful hybrid memoir, which reclaims the status of anti-man, and to hear from him what it means for a queer brown writer to transgress genre distinctions, time linearity, and monolingual mandates of publishing in the US. In the off chance that you are meeting Rajiv for the first time, here is a brief biographical sketch. Rajiv was born in London and raised in Central Florida. From U of Florida, he earned a BA in religious studies. He earned a master's in education and teaching English to speakers of other languages from Long Island U. With an MFA in poetry and translation from Queens College, CUNY, he came to UH Manoa, where he earned a PhD in English in 2017, along with an undying place in our hearts. Rajiv has been an assistant professor of poetry at Auburn University in Alabama, and he's now a professor in the BFA, MFA program at Emerson College in Boston, excuse me. As a multilingual, multi-genre, queer Guyanese writer of Indian ancestry, Rajiv is deeply invested in telling and amplifying the stories of the descendants of indentured laborers from the Indian labor diaspora. He speaks truth to empire, and he does not flinch. Rajiv is a mentor to many and an inspiration to even more. If you've been following his career at all, you'll know something of the following accolades that he has been receiving, perhaps starting with his 2014 prize that he got through UH for the Academy Poets Prize, all the way up through the award that his memoir won in 2019 for a new immigrant writing from Restless Books. He is a well-decorated writer. His work also refuses to sit still. He is multilingual, multi-genre, multi-skinned. Maybe this shouldn't surprise us. We must not pen in a whale. He has six chapbooks of poetry. I didn't have an image, I think, of one of these, but I have most of them here. 3 full-length books of poems. Cutlish was also just came out this year, which is another stunning collection. This work in translation, and of course, the hybrid memoir that is today's discussion. Again, publishing endorsements for Rajiv's works are enthusiastic and numerous, but maybe there are still room for some new ones. I've been thinking about Maya Angelou lately, who said famously, "I've learned that people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." Rajiv, your work and you make us all feel so much. So in light of the "This is your life" feel of brown bag introductions, I invited a few friends to join me in contributing language to introduce you. I'll skim these now for the sake of time, but I'll obviously share these fully with you after the talk, Rajiv. From one of your earliest poetry champions who continues to cheer for you, Rajiv, you are whale, bellow, ink, phosphorescence, new sun, oxygen. From our own at UH Manoa, You are an amazing mentor. You are iconic. You are a role model. You are an amazing poet. You inspired a creative, loving, intellectually ambitious, passionate, and fun sense of community among graduate students. Cindy Franklin also says that she's your fangirl, which is its own amazing thing. You are breathtaking, an enormously generous spirit. You are a beautiful writer, thinker, and person. You are poetry. You are known for your relentless work ethic. If you know Rajiv, Joanna says you are familiar with this feeling of being acknowledged, of instantly finding community, though he is one person. You write works that we wish we could share with our teenage selves. You are someone known for your diligence, courage, and talent. You are a star for the ways you uplift other writers and share knowledge as if it were water and bread. And my God, what a smile. From the wider literary world where you continue to thrive and inspire, you are uncompromising in the face of colonial, imperialist, racist, patriarchal, homophobic, and transphobic brutality. That smile comes up again. And Cynthia says, though there is a knife under your tongue. You are an immense talent, and that talent is matched by your warmth. You are a sis-star in poetry. Hari also calls himself your fanboy. This is not, I didn't make this up. Your work is a gift that hangs in the playroom of children as they gain their music lessons. You take our breath away. And from a former student at your very own Emerson, where you're currently located, you are an intellect rooting for your students' greatness. You are more than just a professor, but also an extraordinary mentor who every student deserves. Dear Rajiv, thank you for all you continue to help us feel. Genre shapeshifting, whaleman of our dreams, poet, prophet, champion. Welcome across the interwebs back to Hawaii for this reading. On behalf of all your fangirls, fanboys, fan people who are here in the Zoom room and who are with us in spirit, we're so excited to get to hear you today and to lift you up in joy. Please join me in welcoming Rajiv.
Okay, it's I might need just a second to collect myself, so I usually save the crying for after my reading. Thank you so much. Hold on just one second, please. Thank you so much for that introduction. My God, and thank you all for being here and for such kind words. You know, I'm so glad to be here with you today. I'm going to share my screen, so this is going to be awkward for just a second, and then it's not going to be awkward, hopefully. But you are here today to hear me talk about ANTIMAN, a hybrid memoir. And so I'll begin. Thank you. My name is Paul Remy Rajiv Mohabir, and I am the second child of my parents, Chandranarayan Mohabir from Crabwood Creek, Berbice, and Anjani Devi Prasad of Prasad Nagar, Georgetown, Guyana. Their grandparents and great-grandparents came from the towns and cities of Chennai, Faizabad, Mirzapur, and Varanasi to the Western Hemisphere of Wapishana, Warao, and Arawak lands to work as indentured laborers for the British sugarcane planters. They left India in 1865, 1890, 1894, and other times that we do not know, aboard boats that were the repurposed ships that once bore enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean. I come from these people who have crossed seas through British chicanery and forced migration to a hemisphere where the white supremacy of our governmental systems still did not want us. I was born in London, England, and have lived in many places in the United States, including New York City, Orlando, Florida, Opelika, Alabama, as well as you have heard, in the illegally occupied nation of Hawaii. I greet you now through the Zoom world, interwebs, from the town of Malden in Massachusetts, a site where land is still being contested by the Department of Interior, who in March 2020, when we all went into lockdown due to the pandemic, sought to disband the federally recognized nation of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and to take their lands. With the activism of Chairman Cedric Cromwell and other peoples of this area, the Mashpee were able to work to keep their lands and their recognition. If you are interested in learning more about the native writings from the Northeast that have been moving my heart recently, please follow the link that I'm putting into the chat to the anthology Dawnland Voices, an anthology of Indigenous writing from New England, edited by Siobhan Senier. I want to extend thanks again. Thanks for the first time also to the Center for Biographical Research for making space for me, and to Zoe Sprott, Paige Rasmussen, Craig House, and Cynthia Franklin, who helped to organize this. And of course, to Dr. Anjali Roy, who has been my heart and my compass as I mire through the genres of poetry, nonfiction, and translation, as well as the genres of just living life. Today, or my tonight, I will read from my memoir, ANTIMAN. This book relates the story of how I, as a person of complicated migration histories and queerness, was drawn to poetry through the act of translation, and how translating transformed my engagement with the world of writing, and also the world where I was able to find non-normative love that threatened to break my family, as well as to break me. I'm going to read some sections before I have a very mini talk with you, and then we move into the questions by jumping around through my book. I'm going to read some sections, and I'm going to present a sense of the narrative and what I mean by hybridity. And then I'll talk a little bit about the tensions between narrative nonfiction as prose, and the space for poetic and lyric flight in the genres that open up for me. The first section I'm going to read is called Aji Recording. Aji is the word for paternal grandmother in Caribbean Hindustani, in Guyanese Bhojpuri, as well as Indian Standard Bhojpuri. Aji Recording Biba Kare, which means wedding, to get married. And to set the scene, I'll just begin. Before my brother Emil's wedding, Aji sat at the dinner table wrapped in my childhood comforter, a blue and white floral print over her pink dress. My tape recorder hummed and beat out a cassette tape pulse. Emil was not the first of Aji's 42 grandchildren to marry, but he was special to her. He was her second eldest son. He was her second son's eldest son. If they had been back home, it would have been time for community. I was 20 and could feel the ghosts that haunted our new rituals, some ghosted magic haunting our family. I was eager to write down and learn what I could of poetry from this woman with coarse white hair, a tattooed forearm, and a developing aneurysm swelling with love. Today is the Hardi, she said. Today, the Dulaha ke mumma go rub him with haldi. Rub him with haldi? Why? I asked, taking notes. For make his skin shine so that you got hey handsome, and the woman now go take one next man. She laughed a deep croak. Aji loved her jokes, especially when it came to teasing me and my sister and my brother. She grew up in New Amsterdam, Guyana, the daughter of Jahang Bahadur and Anupya Singh. Jang Bahadur was known all over for his mithai and pera. He owned several cows and made sweets from their milk. Aji spoke often of her love for him. Her mother, Anupya, however, was not the same gentle soul. She insisted that Aji be raised in a proper fashion, learning to chanke dal and bele round roti, not to climb mango trees and run and skip in the blackwater trenches that lined the streets before the stilted houses. Aji sat at the table recalling the Amazon jungle, how her husband married her at 15, and how her mother had protested. He been big for me for 6 years. She fingered an engagement ring. He put this ring upon my finger and tell me, Papa, you go marry me. It was a rose-colored Guyanese insignia ring with the initials SM printed on it. SM, Siudas Mohabir. Her husband was named as a servant of Shiva. The ring was one of her most cherished possessions, though it was not the actual ring that Aja had put on her finger, but something remade, perhaps in Toronto, by a Guyanese jeweler. The ring itself was filled with Aja and Aji's love story, with all the wedding time songs and rituals that made her life a life. Every recounting of their connection imbued the ring with more of her history. She looked at me through her rose-colored glasses. She was named after the Ganga, the river, and my Aja was named after Lord Shiva, creating together the sacred story once more. Behind her gray eyes were songs that could crush the earth with their impact. I knew that she had stories. She could sing with the voice of the sea. She said that here, every ocean is the holiest river because that is precisely where it flows. The stream starts in the Himalayas as glacial melt and trickles through the land, through Lord Shiva's matted locks and deltas of the Sundarbans, and loosens her own tresses into the Bay of Bengal. Ganga was a journeyer, like my Aji. It made sense that she would call the sea Ganga Ghat, or the steps to the Ganga, every time we took her to swim at the beach. Behind Aji's eyes, the Himalayas pushed up into cataract crags. River dolphins traded their eyesight for echolocation, and I understood the reason for prayer. It was to connect me to this woman, this living ancestor. But sing me the oldest song you can remember, Aji, I asked, the cassette recorder meting out its own pulse. It was a drum by which Aji could remember. Mina able beta, may bais na god. She closed her eyes, she opened her mouth, and outstreamed the river Ganga's crash. I'm presenting to you now one of the songs that my grandmother sang in this moment when I was 20 years old. And I won't tell you what year that is. And I translate it and transform it into Creolese and then into English. दलहन रोए रोए पिया के घरे जाना काहे के रोए पिया के घरे जाना पिया के घरे जाना पिया के घरे जाना काहे की रोए पिया के घरे जाना सासुर मारे मारे बांस डंडा लेके सासुर मारे मारे ननगरी आवे पिया के घरे जाना पिया के घरे जाना काहे के रोए पिया के घरे जाना सैया मारे मारे बांस डंडा लेके सैया मारे मारे बांस डंडा लेके सैया मारे मारे गाले में भाई डाल के सैया मारे मारे गाले में भाई डाल के पिया के घरे जाना पिया के घरे जाना काहे के रोए पिया के घरे जाना दुल्हन रोए रोए पिया के घरे जाना काहे के रोए पिया के घरे जाना हम कैसे जाबो ससुराल चुनरी में लागल दाग कैसे हम छिपाओ चुनरी में लागल दाग दुल्हन cry for going husband house. You cry and how we just cry. Father-in-law and mother-in-law just beat me. Sister-in-law just sent insult. My husband just give me lash with one piece bamboo. My husband just beat me after he grabbed my throat. How me go at my father-in-law house? Me only get one stain. How me go hide them? Me only get one stain. The bride cries. She must go to her lovers. She cries because she must go. My in-laws will beat me. My sister-in-law will curse me out. The bride cries, she must go to her lovers. She cries because she must go. My love will hold my neck and beat me with a bamboo rod. She cries because she must go. How will I go to my in-laws with a stained veil? How will I hide it, the stain in my veil? The bride cries, she must go to her lovers. She cries because she must go. So after that instance where I'm sitting with my Aji in that room in Florida, as we progress through the memoir, I go to India on a study abroad trip through the University of Wisconsin to Varanasi, India, where the language on the street is indeed Bhojpuri, so the ancestor language to what my Aji spoke. And this is a picture of my Aji. When she was younger, clearly her face. And you can see when, at the end of this, you'll see her behind me. But I had studied in Varanasi in India for the academic year. And while I went there, the students had to give had to write an undergraduate thesis that was based on some aspect of the culture that they were finding there. Because I was so interested in Bhojpuri folk music, and because Bhojpuri was the lingua franca, or the language that was spoken on the street, I tasked myself to come up with enough transcriptions and to record as many possible songs as I could in order to retell the narrative of the Ramayana, which is one of the epics that my Aji actually sat and could recount in her own Bhojpuri iteration. And parts of the stuff, many of the things that I was dealing with while I was traveling in India, and also coming into terms of my adult sexuality, was queerness and fitting outside of what was decided for me to be my norm, or what I should have been. And so another aspect and layer of that is the brokenness that we as Caribbean people had completely internalized. We are not Indian, we are not fully Caribbean, because there's always the marker of we are Indian, we're East Indian, we're East Indian. We're told that when we go to India, are we even Indian? And so it's these levels that the Rajiv, who I present in the beginning parts of my memoir, is considering as he walks through. This is when this next section called Evolution of a Song happens when I am going to the Ram Mandir on the outskirts of Varanasi. And I go with a translator to help me record and to transcribe the songs. And we meet this ancient Baba, who is a renunciant who has taken vows of celibacy. And I ask him to sing the oldest song that he can remember. And here is this piece. The air was thick, not with exhaust fumes, but with my hope. It descended like the fruit bats that returned daily from their dawn perches, having eaten their nightly fill in the trees in Madanpura. The Baba reached back into his childhood in Bihar. He closed his eyes. The first song I'll sing will be a Tumri, he said, and he began to sing. His voice was fluid, clear, strong like bricks that make a dam. I didn't write down the words, but I recorded his voice on my tape recorder. He sang about the monsoons and about how King Dasarath was injured on a hunting trip. The king killed a deer that was really a boy and was then cursed by his parents. But stumbling through the forest, the king pricked his finger. The splinter made him deathly ill, so he called for his beloved queen, Kaikeyi. She came and removed the splinter and restored the king's health. He gave her 2 promises to be fulfilled. I was astonished. I shifted in my seat and I thought about my Aji and her own way of telling the Ramayana that echoed this Baba's. But that's not how Kaikeyi received her 2 boons, Kumar, my interpreter, interjected. She drove the king's chariot into battle and saved his life on the battlefield. It's written in the Ramayana, written by Tulsidas, as well as Valmiki. The Baba looked at him for a while and then at me. This is an old version that we tell in Gazipur. Gazipur was a district in Bihar where the Baba was born. He admitted some truth about his former self, this self that belonged to the world of living and dying, samsara. I know this version, I chimed in. My Aji sings a song about this, about how Kaikeyi actually saved Dasarath by pulling out a splinter from his finger. This was the broken part of our diasporic identity, an alternative version of Valmiki's Ramayana and Goswami Tulsidas's Sri Ramcharitamanas. and the televised serial Ramayana that all work together to erase. Maybe all stories became fixed when we tried to stretch them to fit everyone and everything. Maybe there's no one singular Ramayana, no one way to tell the story. If Kumar didn't recognize it as Ramayana, maybe my Indianness was fluid too. You know, there are so many differences in the way that our people tell the Ramayana story here from how they do in Ghazipur, but the real Ramayana is in the heart, said the Baba. A flock of doves had been released in my stomach and I sprouted wings. I could feel the sensation of flying, perfect weightlessness. But there were still several major problems. The Ramayana's Ram upholds caste. In the name of truth, he betrays his wife. But Baba, how do you justify the cruelty of Ram? If he really were Vishnu incarnated into the world, why would he have tortured his wife by leaving her in the forest to die and constantly questioning her fidelity? We cannot understand the entirety of Leela, the play of gods, the Baba said. I stood up. The blood flowed hot into my thighs and legs. My feet could feel their thirst. I wanted to believe, but could only see metaphor. I sat back down. Though my learning here was deeply spiritual, it was not for religious edification. I was trying to understand my Aji's music and the ballads that I came from. My father's ancestors were mostly unlettered. Our stories were invaluable. Our literature bloomed as lotuses in our throats. Or Gayeji, please sing some more, I asked. With a clap on my back, the Baba smiled and laughed. The sudden slap knocked the frustration out of me. One day your questions will change, beta. Ramayan ke upar, this song is a Purvik, an Eastern song, he said. It's so old, I don't know exactly where it came from, but it was sung in my village, the Baba told us. The afternoon sun began its burn, but we were shaded in the middle of the courtyard. The Baba sang. Avadha nagariya se nikale do kumar, dhanus leke chale galan. Ke kahi mange bheje khatir, Raja ke jaan bachayal manchwa par, Ajodhya tohar hoi jai, Jai mango to mango rani. Hum mange Raja tohar battiya, Hum mange Ram banbas jai, Aur Bharat Raja chalai ho, Jai mango to mango rani. I was frozen. I couldn't believe that this Baba at Ram Mandir Ashram was singing my Aji's song almost word for word. Aji had been separated from India for over a century, but this song that I was hearing felt intact. Two princes leave the town carrying bows. Kaikeyi wished to exile them, having saved the king's life once. Ayodhya is yours. Whatever you wish for, ask, my queen. I wish, dear king, for your boons. I wish Ram exiled and Bharat to rule the throne. Whatever I wish for, I ask. I gulped. I looked around. The birds in the courtyard were listening too. I was pecking at the grains of my connection to this place. The grass in the direct light began its daily wilt. I glanced at Kumar. He checked his watch again. My time with the Baba was coming to an end. What else can you tell me about this song? My mouth was dry. I was surprised myself with the desperation in my voice. It's old is all I know. I know that women used to sing this kind of song about Ramayana. I called it a Purvik because it comes from the east of here. The sun started to paint shadows of canyons on the Baba's face. His skin sagged and folded too heavily for the muscle that once held it in place. I remembered Aji's own frame when she first sang her version of this song to me. The song itself showed that even queens are servants in their own homes. The feminist critique of this song would show the scars of patriarchy, marring all the members of my family, my nani, Aji, my mother, my sister, my queer kin, and my own body that had been indelibly carved and scarred by this story. Sita, Ram's wife, who he abandoned, was eventually swallowed by the earth. as final proof that she was chaste, devoted to her husband when Ravan kidnapped her. Babaji, I know this song, I said to the Baba. My Aji used to sing it to me and taught me the stories that you are telling me, your version of Ramayana, I said with wide eyes. Sing for me the version you know. He smiled and looked at Kumar, and I sang. So moving on from here, I say a lot that my inspiration for poetry writing came from the act of translation and from translating these songs. But to be quite honest, it was through the mirror of a friend that I was able to understand myself as a poet first, and to be audacious enough to commit my own acts of poetry to the page and writing. And this is my dear friend, Ryan. And so when we get to this part of the book, I had left Florida. I'd come back from India. I visited my Aji, and I talked to her about, what India was like. And then I moved to New York City to become a New York City teaching fellow. And that's when I started to flirt with having writing and translation writing and poetry be at the forefront of my mind. I'm boarding a town to go to visit my friend Ryan, who just broke up with a partner of his. And Ryan is a creative individual who in this book and in real life is also a poet. It's about maybe 3 years after that incident that we just heard. I boarded a Chinatown bus from Midtown to Baltimore. In my notebook, I kept a record of my thoughts. I was thinking of Aji and her songs, translating them into a language that I could use. I carried a cassette player with me and transcribed the lyrics of one of Aji's songs as I sat on the bus. I stopped the tape and wrote down one word at a time. There was one particular Kabir poem that she sang when I last saw her that I wanted to remember. It was a chutney song that she said had a deeper kind of meaning than just dancing. चुनरी पहन के पियासे मिलेंगे सैया पियासे मिलेंगे तुम हो चतुर सयाना तुम हो चतुर सयाना ससुरे घरे जाना. I tie my veil to meet my love. Love, no matter how clever no matter how clever you are, you will have to leave for your real home. That kind of song was a nirgun, a song about death, but really about living. I'd heard these kinds of songs in Varanasi as well. The overarching metaphor of the body as a veil permeated my thoughts. My body is a veil that I wear and discard, or at least this is what the philosophy behind this kind of poem said. New Jersey raced by the window as I considered impermanence. I liked teaching ESL K through 12 in New York City, but I wanted to leave this job before I became bitter. The young students deserved better than that. The Department of Education was a mess, funding issues, racism, all of the things to put the onus of making children learn on the shoulders of individuals instead of the system. I didn't know what I wanted to do. When I moved to New York City, I knew that I just wanted to live there in New York for several years. There was somewhere else I wanted to be. My phone buzzed. It was Seth. I silenced it. I'll call him later, I thought, who was a man that I was tangling with. Outside, Jersey again was rushing past. I thought of the road trips that I had taken with my parents and siblings in the past. This was different. The bus was peopled with travelers like me, those who wanted to save a dime and those who wanted to bring in with them old school boom boxes to blast the latest Chinese hits for our long crawl down the eastern seaboard. Those who were finally meeting themselves in a big city. The road lasted the length of this translation, and I began to write my own Nirgun poems. The bus dropped me off into the parking lot of an abandoned grocery store. Ryan came with his friend Shayna. We hugged and crawled into Shayna's car and sped off to Ryan's apartment. She dropped us off and went home to get ready for the evening. Ryan's 2-bedroom was dark and smelled like grief. He went to the kitchen without kicking off his shoes and poured us both whiskey gingers. Jonathan and Shayna arrived at the apartment within minutes. Jonathan greeted Ryan with a firm hug and offered me his hand in greeting. Shayna's hair was aflame with red and orange, and her very presence scalded me. "Hey there, you both look a little dry," Ryan said, and slipped into the kitchen to prepare more drinks. "You want to come dancing with us tonight?" he asked them. "Nah, you guys go and slay him," Shayna said. They put their jackets on and left the apartment. In the Baltimore gutter scene, Ryan and I danced and danced. By the time we left the apartment, I had no idea where I was or what I was doing. None of it mattered. Baltimore was a sticky city with an electronic gutter music scene that kept us sweating and dancing for our lives. I was celebrating the breakage in me, the permission to write the ugly and to share it with my friends. Ryan had just read to us from his chapbook of poems that was just actually published this year. It's about to be 6 months since that book was published. And he was the first queer South Asian poet that I had ever met and fell into contact with and deep friendship with. Amidst the din and the fog of the club, I remembered what an astrologer had told me in India. He said that I do have an artistic palm, but my problem was that I had to commit to one form of art, and that if I did that, then I would go far. I thought the art that I would commit to would be astrology, originally. But now something else was happening. I was moved by Ryan's openness and his own poetry, and was now moving my way through this process by dancing. Something else broke for me too. The next day, I boarded the Chinatown bus back to New York. I was glad to return with my new resolve. The night before, Ryan had told me, "You keep writing too. I see you, always writing things down in your journal." He was an artist and restless, like me. I could allow myself to be a writer. I could be a poet. Ryan had held me tight and told me that he loved me too, and that he was lucky that I was in his life. We didn't have to tell each other this. We were so close that my tasting him didn't complicate anything. As Baltimore began to blur, I reached up and pulled off my hat and fixed my hair. The bald spot was so big. Outside, a hawk flew high above the bus and followed us. It felt like a message that I must allow poetry to be a reality in my life, to connect me to the divine. I felt for my head. I pulled out my journal. What would I write? I flipped through my notebook and saw my translations and transcreation of Aji's folk songs. I had been writing this entire time. My head swam. Through translation, journaling, or writing poems and fragments, I had been writing all along. I hadn't been able to see myself without my reflection through a beloved until Ryan held up a mirror to my face. It felt as though my consciousness was looking at my life from a hawk's perspective. I could see that this whole time I had been alive on this earth, that I was tied to poetry, that it was from my umbilicus. I just hadn't recognized it. Aji's songs and stories were poetry that I was working with, and it was working through me. And this was the poetry that I descended from, and I could hear its music inside me as I read my own words. Had I always been surrounded by poetry in many languages? I was so used to overlooking what I was doing, thinking that I wasn't able to do this feat of writing, that I was not good enough, that I was not enough. I rubbed my head and I was frustrated by my hair loss. I made a promise to myself right then and there on the road from Baltimore to Jackson Heights in 2007, this hawk as my witness. I would shave my head when I returned to Jackson Heights as a reminder that I have dedicated my life to poetry. And here's the reading portion of my presentation is done. And so I'm just gonna share with you some quick words. In the article of How Queer Authors Are Creating Queer Forms, published by Electric Lit, Alana Duncan states, and this is the Alana Duncan quote, but I just wanted to kind of transition from the reading into what will be our discussion, and that was a very awkward transition. So please excuse me. Can I have some kind of reaction from Anjali if you can see the quote on my screen, because I'm seeing a couple of things. I'm seeing one screen that has the actual quote. Okay, good. Okay, fabulous. Okay, so now like imagine I'm doing like a what is it called, like a scene end, whatever, transition time now. To talk a little bit about hybridity of form and what it meant to create a form. And I really like this quote, and it's from the article of how queer authors are creating queer forms, published in Electric Lit, and it's written by Ilana Duncan. She says, just as queerness has become increasingly inclusive and expansive, there are countless ways to queer a form and make space for these voices, queer voices. Queer forms in writing express not only the urge, but the necessity of fracturing the traditional narrative structure or genre in order to create for queer authors or queer characters to express their world and make space for their stories. And in both the ordinary and extraordinary, we find these queernesses of form. Now, to be clear, when I talk about queerness, I'm talking specifically about the bodies and practices of sexuality that resist the cis heteropatriarchal normatives of society. And this is a method, yes, I recognize, as well as an anti-categorical way of being in the world, by articulating a kind of bodily precarity. And now both of these are important to my thinking through the configuring of the queer, at least for how I use it personally and the way I think about it in my craft. What does that mean when it interacts with this term hybridity? What the hybridity of memoir and poetry in this particular memoir that I have written allows for me is actually to make space for a new form and engagement, as well as allowing for a fractured meta-narrative of what makes a story, opening up the world of nonfiction to the writing in ways of oral transmission and culture. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And you can see me in full. And like I said, here's a better picture of my Aji. But what I mean by this specifically is that I'm actually troubled by this. And maybe this is a question that we can like parse out together, the parts of it, as well as possible answers. But I draw on oral traditions from my Caribbean inheritance, which is both South Asian as well as, Creole, in order to create what is essentially a creolized text that is trilingual, that merges various ways of storytelling and story retelling and re-envisioning the old and repurposing it into something new. And this idea of approach to writing memoir specifically has been termed by people outside as a queerness that I'm interacting with, when I see it as queer, yes, because of content and a form, but also hearkening back to non-normative practices of storytelling. And when I say normative and non-normative, this comes into contact with the idea of the colony and the post-colonial and the colonial structures of the authentic text from the Caribbean, which, based on colonial education, was often British English text. But anyway, so just a little, I'm throwing that nugget out into the broad ocean for you to latch onto if that is something that you would like to talk about in this next section of my talk today. And thank you so much. I'm going to call Dr. Roy back, I think.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Craig, do you want to do this? I can also, I'm happy to help moderate questions.
Way you go.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Oops. My bad.
Hi, everybody. Sorry. So welcome back, and thank you so much for that, Rajiv. I feel like we can all, virtually clap for you. It's always such an honor to hear from you and to hear you read your own work in your own language and to perform it. So much of this text is also songbook, and I have said it before, I'll say it again, we need an audio book. I feel like Restless Books can hook this up. If not, I have a nice microphone. I feel like we can figure this out. But yeah, let's have some Q&A. You folks, if you want to get into the chat, I think that's the protocol for CBR. You can write your quotes or write your questions into the chat, and I'll be happy to amplify them there. I have some starter questions to maybe just get the ball rolling here, but Rajiv, can I ask you two, and then maybe you can decide which one you want to answer?
Yes, options. I love it.
Okay, all right. So here's option one. Memoir and its fragmentation, which I think speaks to that beautiful quote from Electric Lit, might be the way we piece together pieces of ourselves. Do you feel like you have more pieces of yourself now, having written this powerful story? And if so, does this piecing together feel different than writing your beautiful books of poetry and your works of translation? That's my first option. Option two is, if my memory serves me, you've said that when you first started publishing poetry, a mentor of yours said you'd need to prepare to write a memoir too. Is this advice you give to burgeoning poets today? Must all poets write a memoir at some point too? Hashtag Team Creative Nonfiction.
Ooh, these are great and devastating questions. Can I ask you to put them in the chat as well, so I can refer back to them? I'll take a stab at answering both at the same time. So yeah, like what is the difference essentially between writing memoir as well as poetry? Yeah, the piecing together feels different in terms of poetry and translation and nonfiction. In that translation, I feel there are actually boundaries of a text, as well as you know, how far you can actually bend translation in order to have it be something not influenced by, but rather be a translation. And I think about that in terms of the structure of these folk songs that I'm so obsessed with. And I think like one of the things you can see in my reading tonight, as well as in the memoir, is this fixation for me and how it allows space to think about form in poetry too. So in some ways, like in this new book of poems, I've created a form based on a chutney song, which brings that same kind of idea of constriction that translation offers into the act of poetic creation. Now, with time is something that you can see in nonfiction and in nonfiction prose that it can be collapsed, it can be condensed. There's a whole bunch of things that can be done. However, it does not have the same elasticity. It's not as plastic as poetry. You know, with poetry, I like to use this metaphor. If you've ever taken a class with me, or if I've ever talked to you about writing, you probably have heard this before, so excuse me. So with prose, I like to think of it like this, that I'm in a house and I'm calling to you from the street, and I'm saying, hey, come here, come here. You come to the front door, I open the door, I give you a hug, and I take you by the hand, and I show you the living room, I show you the kitchen, I show you the bathroom. We go upstairs, you see the bedroom, you see the dog's bedroom, you see, like, you know, my weird collection of curios, and then you know the story, right? Because I've shown it to you. With poetry, what I do is I call to you as you're walking down the street from my house, and I call to you, and you come to the door, and you open the door, and you walk into the house, and I'm still calling to you. And it's up to you to make your way through the rooms of the house to my voice. And so this is like the metaphor that I use between thinking how I think through prose and poetry. And so when also considering a mentor of mine, the wonderful writer, poet, and critic, Rigoberto Gonzalez, said to me, you know, you are going to have to, when your first book's coming out, in order to be, like, you know, seen, you're going to have to keep on telling stories about what is the world around your book of poems. So I actually began to write these essays about what my poetry was about. I mean, there were no other you know, there were no other models of poetry for Indo-Caribbean people in the United States. So it was like, basically I was shouting into an abyss. And so Rigo was like, you have to create a platform for yourself. So I did that. And it was actually you, Dr. Roy, who said to me, oh, but look at all of these essays. This is a memoir. Whales don't just write essays, they write memoirs, if I'm quoting you. And so, you know, it was with that kind of, maybe this is a memoir after all, that I did piece this together, and then it had its own life, you know. And so I think I'll end there. I've only answered one of your questions.
No, you did a beautiful job. It felt like you answered them both. Thank you. Okay, so in the chat, Zoe is asking, in creative writing programs, we're often told to consider genre categories and how our works fit into those so we can pitch a publishable text. How did/would you approach that with a hybrid text like this?
Ooh, so searing. And I'm not gonna like, and because this is like a hot button topic, not just for students, but also for faculty, from what I'm understanding. And I think that it's a great thing to think about. Just what is genre and what does genre distinction do for literature, and why is it that the market is so important? And I think it's like for prose, there's more of a likely, like, this is weird to say, like all the prose writers I know are probably going to be like, Rajiv, that's misinformation, but it just seems that there's more money available to people who write prose, right? So I mean, that, like I said, genre is driven by market. When it comes to poetry, the truth of the poetry readers is like, it's kind of, poetry books don't sell very well. So publishers of poetry aren't in it for the money, whereas like, people who publish, works of prose might very well be, and they might also very much love writing. So what I'll say is that approaching the hybrid form is something that's gaining more and more traction. More and more people are doing it. The Poet Laureate of the United States just released a hybrid memoir called Poet Warrior, and it's gorgeous. There are other hybrid memoirs that are out there. Maggie Nelson is somebody who I'm thinking about as well. Rigoberto Gonzalez is also someone who writes in hybrid styles, and especially in Autobiography of My Hungers. But then again, these are like, Rigo's book is not like, a New York Times bestseller, but it is so incredibly powerful. So that's, I think, the question of genre is, for me, linked to that question as well. How does the press want to market it? And like, what does that mean in terms of, submitting to agents and that kind of thing? It's wise to have a pitch. It's wise to think through these things, for sure. And I think that one of the things for nonfiction that I've learned, that I was just telling my friend Ryan today, was that, agents are happy to see outlines, with like a completed chapter or two before they like try to sell your work. Whereas with prose fiction, it's more like they want to see everything. But don't quote me here on this, as this is like, the fiction genre is not something that I'm very well versed in. So thank you for the question.
So our beautiful Aiko Yamashiro in the chat has said, so happy to hear your powerful voice, Rajiv. It made my whole day change. I just wanted to amplify that, so we made sure to get her in here too. I have a genre question, another genre question. I have a million questions. I could talk to you all day. Everyone, don't let me be the only one asking questions though. Put your questions in the chat. I'm happy to not do this. Yeah, okay, so I'm just gonna do this one. This is fine. I have a list of them. Once upon a time, before your first book was published, you worried that publishing a book-length work might never happen for you. As of today's counting, you have published 5 books and 6 chapbooks, and won countless awards. If you could travel back in time, what would you tell yourself before you won your first book award? Or what advice would you give to writers who have not yet published their books, but have even a fraction of your drive?
I'd say to myself, so there's like, this is like undergirding this advice is about privilege and material privilege. Who gets to get these academic positions based on what they've not published, or like not publishing at all kind of thing, versus like who can? For me, the fire was very real, especially when I was at the University of Hawaii. I'm a first generation college student. I'm very, very recently, family-wise literate in English, as well as very recently become a speaker of English just a generation or two. And so for me, like the idea was that after my MFA and studying for the PhD, it was so that I could try to position myself into getting a tenure track job, which is like, you know, the exception to the rule. There are no jobs out there, but there are jobs out there for the right folks with the wheels that are greased in the right way, which was not me at all. And so one of the ways that I did that, or that I saw to kind of like attempt this, was what my parents call an immigrant work ethic, right? They say tie your belt ke walk, like tie your belt tight and work hard so that you don't feel the pangs of hunger, so that you can continue to work. And I would say that that's not a sustainable way of living in the world. It's a way to survive, but it's not sustainable. I would tell my younger self, yes, be in that fire, like let that fire consume you because it's amazing, but also make a plan for when there's no more firewood. How are you going to sustain a career and have your writing career be long instead of short and brightly burning? And that's the advice that I would go back to give myself, because I wouldn't have listened to any advice being like, slow down, relax, like take a chill pill, Rajiv, you know, like my friend Neha always says. I would just be like, yeah, that's okay for everyone else, but not for me. And I'm not saying that that's like a healthy way to be in the world. And in fact, I think it can be quite damaging. So the advice that I would give to people is to trust your internal guru. You know, what is the writer in you saying to you about what you're doing, and do that. And like, to be quite honest, when I was a student, sometimes I was a really great student and sometimes I was a real shitty student. I would like clear my desk of everything and say to myself, writing is my first job. You know, everything else is secondary. And that was, you know, partially in my MFA, partially in the PhD. I don't really, I no comment about my current situation, but that said, yeah, that's the advice that I would give.
Amazing, amazing advice. Cindy has a question here in the chat. She says thank you for the great talk, John, and whale friend. I didn't know we could put whale emojis in the chat. Amazing. I know that being in Hawaii shaped the writing you did and do. Can you talk about how being in New England is shaping the writing you are doing?
Thank you so much for this question. Yeah, because I feel like whatever place I inhabit, there's like a big change that I see psychically in myself that, you know, comes out in my writing. Being in New England has been really interesting. So I am on, you know, the land of the Pawtucket and the Wabanaki, as well as the Wampanoag. And so the lands Nipmuc as well kind of blend here. And I live in Malden. It's a town north of Boston, and just outside is a marsh. And there's some like signage here about the history of the settler colonial state of Boston. And what was really interesting to find out was that there has been conversation, you know, through the whaling industry between Hawaii'ne and the Kanaka Maoli folks, as with people here in Massachusetts, like south, definitely in New Bedford and Nantucket, as well as up far north here. You know, where there had been a Hawaiian church that was in the area, as well as like a big Hawaiian community in the 1800s. And then it's like part of this history that I've been interested in. My partner is a historian, so it's kind of easy work for me to do because he's also interested in this as well. And so thinking about that and thinking about what it means to have like journeyed through Hawaii and to know a little bit about what it means to, and to learn from folks there and to learn a little bit about what can I do with my own kind of colonial, post-colonial heritage and history to resonate with the struggles of folks around me. And another thing that's really interesting is, you remember the Salem witch trials, right? You know, everybody learns about it. Oh, it was so terrible. Like, you know, a handful of white folks died. Meanwhile, genocide was happening on the continental United States. Not to diminish any death, but what I'm saying here is like perspective. One of the things that I forgot until I came back was that Tituba was from Barbados. there had also been colonial contact between the Caribbean as well as this exact part of Massachusetts that I'm living in. So for me, being in Massachusetts has like shaped a lot of things. And also to Cindy's point, there is a North Atlantic subspecies of humpback whale that goes from the Caribbean to the Boston Harbor as their yearly migration route. So it's been really interesting also to like connect those threads as well. And so nothing is formed. It'll take a great while before any cohesive project comes from this, but I've definitely been excited to find all of these connections for myself through holding myself responsible to the history of where I am.
And I'd like to jump in here for a second and point out that Gabriel Brass has asked, what are all your degrees and what is your favorite and why? And I just wanted to remind you who is hosting this talk.
Thank you so much. You know, actually, that's a great question. I had a great time in doing all of the degrees that I've done. And it's hard to say which was my favorite, because they all offered me different things. You know, I was a very intense grad student. Ask anybody here, and they'll be like, "Oh, Rajiv needs to take a pill," and it's true. I was very much that focused and intense, and I made a lot of noise, and I feel like I wouldn't sit down. So that's part of it. And like in the MFA, so my journey through the MFA was one that was atypical as well. I took 4 years to do my 2-year degree, and I took a year off. And I went to India as a fellow for the AIIS, the American Institute of Indian Studies trip, where I translated Kabir, a medieval poet. And that was a really cool opportunity, as well as you know, working so intensely with the poets there, as well as coming to Hawaii and learning also, you know, about, I called it a political education on the run for me, because I had to learn how to be quiet. I had to learn how to listen and not be the one who was speaking. Irony of irony, because maybe I'm long-winded. But one of the things also that I learned here was, you know, poetry has a life. It can change things. Poetry can like knock the doors down. And that's something wonderful to see enlivened by the poets here, you know, with Craig Santos Paris and Brandy Nalani McDougall and No'u Ravilla, also people who are really changing things and working to really do, oh, hi, no, to show the potential of what poems can do. Poems don't just live in books, right? They're in our throats, they resist, they are testament to being here and alive and queer.
And I will jump in here to thank Rajiv for returning virtually and giving a talk that everybody appreciated really greatly. And I'd also like to thank Anjali, and this is also a reunion of her with the center, and I think she did a wonderful job of introducing you. Whenever you can get the speaker to cry before they start speaking, that's always a good sign, as long as you're not beating up on them. At any rate, I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and I hope we'll see you next week and the week after that. And great to see you again, Rajiv, and aloha to everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. This is just so lovely to be amongst you.